Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Folks, we have a real treat for you today. As you know, oftentimes we love to bring on guests here to get different perspectives on things, and we love to go to our veteran community, and we got a great one for you. You're going to really love this today. This is Jason Beardsley, who is the Director of Veterans Initiatives at Stand Together, is a combat vet, 2 times Bronze Star winner, winner of the coveted infantryman combat infantryman's badge, which we'll have to get a story behind that one of these days, I'm sure. But Jason, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I appreciate everything you've done in the public space to really help craft a policy that's more tied to the constituents, tied to the veterans. So let's do it. I'm excited.
This is going to be great. And if you could, just a little bit, kind of tell us what Veterans Initiatives that Stand Together even is, because some of our folks aren't familiar with that group.
Yeah, it's really about shaping the policies and understanding how we protect America's best interests when we put that first and understand how to deploy our resources wisely so that we have the resources to be able to flex the diplomacy that we need. We see diplomacy as, the first part of statecraft, and when it comes time to use the military, that should be done very judiciously. And when it's done judiciously and we have accountability, we have a much more, I'll call it, respectful foreign policy. So the veterans initiatives inside this sort of group also talks about how those issues are second and third order effects when you come back from combat, through veterans health care and the crises we see on our own streets, with veterans kind of dealing with the burdens that were given to them through this process of going to war, coming back home, having difficulty transitioning. So it's really the whole picture of how do we do this smartly so that we empower not just veterans, but constituents and others who are tied to the American cause, empower them to be the most successful they can. We think that comes through wisdom, some judiciousness, and a healthy respect for the dignity of everyone.
That's awesome, man. Obviously, we're a big endorsement of that, and are grateful to have you on today. We're specifically going to talk to you about an op-ed you had in The Hill on the 4th of January. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But for some of our folks who are not familiar with you, I want to kind of like to set the stage here, because you have a track record, for those who haven't seen you, that is almost unique in being accurate at all different parts of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, many times on this channel, we've shown some of those who haven't gotten it right, like General Petraeus, General Hodges, several of these other guys who have just been disastrously wrong at different places. Well, this time we also show those who got it right. And man, does Jason get it right. First of all, I want to show you on day 1 of the war, he went on the news and gave his assessment of exactly what he thought Putin's objectives were.
From the looks of it, the way Putin invaded the Ukraine from multiple angles, it appears like what he wants to do is use his forces to kind of decapitate the Ukrainian government and install a pro-Putin force in there. And at the end of that, what I think we're going to look for is Putin sort of bargaining back those regions around Kiev and in the Western province so that he maintains his hold in the Eastern province and is able to kind of negotiate out of some of the sanctions that we've already laid on him. So I think his hold right now, and the reason I'll say that is with the amount of forces on the ground, what we haven't seen is an increase in violence that goes into the tens of thousands. And Putin at the end of this has still got to control Ukraine. So nominally, he wants to keep the Ukrainians from being deeply embedded in a guerrilla warfare fight or an insurgency that could last up to 5-10 years.
You are one of the only people, especially in those early phases, that recognized how many troops he had actually sent and what the troop to task ratio is. That, okay, this whole thing about him wanting to resurrect the Soviet Union and roll it, past all the way into NATO was nonsense. They didn't have the troops for that. And you accurately identified that he actually was looking for leverage for negotiated settlement, which they were this close to getting in March, April of that year. And things went south from that. But man, did you have it right on the number then?
Well, you and I had the honor of serving our flag overseas, and I think we've seen this play out before. And of course, we were on the ground with maximum troops, max unlimited resources from air to ground to everything you can imagine, and we dealt with guerrilla insurgency for 10 and 20 years. And
Hmm.
also, in
Right.
our effort to decapitate the leadership, we managed to do that to some degree, and then dealt with the consequences for, again, the next 18, 20 years. So it was just looking at the numbers. A lot of people just do math when they talk about war without understanding the spirit of man. The Revolutionary
Yeah.
War was not a math war.
Right.
Neither are so many others, and so math doesn't get you there. And I heard a lot of pundits and generals and others talking about the math. If we do this many troops or this much in armaments or whatever, but no American soldier in Iraq ever lacked resources. I mean, there were times when the resources were questionable, but we had on-call fire, air power, artillery,
Right.
special operations. We had the whole thing. And so I was reflecting on our own personal experience in a modern war context, and recognize that a lot of people that can see through that would not have estimated Putin to do much more than what we just talked about.
Yeah, and unfortunately, most of the analysis was purely based on emotion and an existing hatred of Russia, which we'll touch on in just a second. Then, at about the 1 year mark, when most analysts were super pro on the Ukraine side because they had just forced Russia out of Kherson City, they had just recaptured that big swath of land around Kharkiv. Everybody was now talking about, yeah, man, General Hodges, we'll just pick on him again. He was saying, yep, Crimea, it's done by the summer, definitely on the done. You, on the other hand, had a little bit more sober view. And in January of that year before the offensive, you had this to say.
It really doesn't have an end in sight. And I think it's important to point out that both sides in this conflict are unable to achieve their maximal objectives. And what does that look like for Russia? Control of the Western Ukraine. For Ukraine, it looks like taking back Crimea and the Donetsk and Luhansk province, when those are really unlikely. And so what you're looking at is we're going to see more of this type of tragedy if we don't look for an off-ramp. And that's where I think the administration of the United States has to be very careful and very helpful in subtly behind the scenes working towards convincing the parties at bay that off-ramp is our best chance of not continuing this for 10 years.
Jason, it is anguishing me to listen to that in the context of when it came in, because there were still so many tens of thousands of Ukrainian men who were alive at the time who aren't now. And if we had only done that and said, hey, don't get heady and think because they had some successes there that's going to translate into successes, in the summer. There's a reason why they succeeded then, and there was a reason why they weren't going to succeed then. And if we had listened to what you said and sought an off-ramp and a negotiated settlement then, this war could be over now, and they could be in the process of rebuilding, and people would still be alive today.
Yeah, Colonel, that's the human tragedy here, and we're aware of it again from ground combat. And the Ukrainian military was not a professionalized military at the extent necessary to
Yeah.
do heavy combat offensive operations in another region. And look, I talked with Ukrainians who have very connected roles inside the leadership there from the very outset, and the ground situation did not look like what a lot of our analysts painted. There was a long-term sort of settling in of the hearts of the eastern provinces that they were essentially by proxy Russian. This was not because they were anti-Ukrainian. It was just a matter of dealing with reality. So a long time ago, they kind of lost the heart of that. So when they were getting ready to kind of fight back for that terrain, this was about putting soldiers who were untrained up against a very, at least, let's call it bountiful military force.
Yeah.
Whether
That's
Russia
well
was
said.
great at that or not doesn't
Yeah.
matter,
Right.
because that's when you really have to take the offensive. And that's a tough, tough fight. The 3-to-1 ratio we're so familiar with. So I thought this was easy to see, which made me very suspicious about a lot of the motives, as you called it, emotional wish casting about how they could win and how this was going to be easy. Combat is not easy, and it's folks like us that actually know that. So this was tough for me.
Yeah, yeah, and it still is, and it got even tougher later in the year when they got into this offensive operation. And then again, you still had people, Petraeus, one of the big ones, that continued to say in July, "Nope, this is still going on. It's a little early, so don't get looking down at it. Things are still going to be working out okay." But you, on the other hand, advocated again for negotiations.
They've got to work for every solution possible to unify their command and ensure that they can bring force against the Russians in sort of a combined arms conflict. But again, they haven't shown any ability to do that over the last 2 years. They've mostly been in the defensive posture. So going on offense takes a lot more, and it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to gain more before the actual negotiations begin.
And you're so diplomatic about it too. I sometimes have a hard time containing my emotions because you were exactly right for all the fundamental reasons, and you were so diplomatic in how you were laying that out there. But again, it was right. And just imagine if we had said, now it's time to start doing negotiations, but instead we just said no. And to this day, now into 2024, we're still trying to say, no, let's give them everything they need so that they can lose more men. I don't know what we're trying to do now.
You know, the American public is wonderful. They support our military. They support the cause of America, and they believe in our efficacy. So they naturally want to lean in terms of victory. But again, when I saw what our command does, what our National Command Authority had done in Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia and other places in Africa, you recognize the same people that are on TV saying, all we have to do is this or all we have to do is that, never did that in our case. They never supported our fight. They never caused us to be able to close with and destroy the enemy. And you were prescient about that in the early days of the Iraq conflict, where a lot of us were not. I was still in the, let's call it bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, like we're going to go win something and, you know, create liberty in the West or something like this, or in the East. And you saw this.
There at first.
Oh, I think we all were. But then you were able to quickly understand what was not happening on the ground. And that's the experience that we need to bring in these discussions to foreign policy. It's really about connecting that American heart of support and victory with the realism of how do we best do that. That's hard to do, but for the diplomacy angle, let's give all credit where it's due. I had a lot of training, so special forces guy, been through the CIA course. So like it's taken years to get enough, let's call it maturity, to hold back what I want to say and say something more pleasing.
Maybe I need to go to that school. Is they got any openings? Because I could probably use a little bit of policy around the edge.
I'll go there with you. I'll go again. It was great. So I just want to attribute and tell the audience how much their investment actually sometimes pays off.
Well, that's good. That's good. So then that's where you are in history. Now let's see where you are right now on a different theater of war. Unfortunately, there's more than one to talk about here, and that's with this January 4th piece in the Hill, where you said that we need the boots on the ground. That this is almost counterintuitive to a lot of Americans. Boots on the ground in the Middle East make Americans less safe, not more. Now that flies in the face of conventional wisdom, because John Kirby the other day actually said, no, actually, this is still needed. He said this.
These groups and the IRGC, the Supreme Leader, they have a choice to make. We're not looking to escalate, but we absolutely have a viable mission in Iraq and Syria to go after ISIS, which is still a viable threat. And we got to make sure that we have the troops and the capabilities to do that.
Now, you say the opposite. You say, no, we actually don't have an enduring mission. It's not keeping us safe. Where do you disagree with what Kirby said?
Well, you know, in theory, part of what Kirby says is not wrong. We must have viable military options, but judicious, wise counsel would suggest that those options should limit our downside. What's our downside? Risk of harm to individuals on the ground. I've been on these FOBs, these sort of forward locations. I've been a singleton out in the middle of these hostile territories. And what happens is you become a target when people know you're there, and you don't have the resources to command a reaction that is sufficient to defend your position. That's why, having flexibility like naval forces or air assets in theater is actually more, you get more nimbleness, you get more prowess. You have the ability to float tons of steel up the coast of somebody's country to say, hey, just in case you forgot, we've got tons of diplomacy we can send down range in a heartbeat, versus having hundreds of men defending a position in the middle of hostile terrain. Like no military commander would ever see that as a winning solution. When special operations are in use, and I know I'm a special operations guy, we are best when we augment and support national strategy that has sufficient resources to close with and destroy the enemy without leaving our men in harm's way. And right now we have men and women sitting in these pockets, isolated, which makes them targets. I talked in the article about Beirut. where we have these troops on the ground for very ambiguous purposes, and they're not welcomed by the locals, and then we lose hundreds of Marines in the Beirut bombing, only for our hawkish, sort of a wonderful President Ronald Reagan to recognize the need to say, hey, this is maybe the wrong disposition. We don't need to be deployed on the ground. That's why we have a Navy. That's why we have an Air Force. And it's remarkable that people have forgotten how naval
Yeah.
powers actually operate in the world.
And I love that symbol, because a lot of people love to say, oh, Reagan, yeah, he was always, throwing heat and using military force. And I'm like, yeah, he's also the one that was the smart one. And instead of deepening our mistake and our disaster in Beirut, he actually withdrew our troops. And what happened? Crickets. Our interests were not harmed. The place didn't fall apart. There wasn't some vacuum that, I don't know, the Soviet Union came and swept into. It just continued on the way it had been centuries before that in our interest, and we cut off our risk that we took. And I think that's a real important point to bring out there. One of the other things that really stood out to me, rereading this again this morning, as of the time you wrote that, you said that there had been 73 near misses on the ground of our troops, which is why, we warn on this channel all the time that we don't want to have to say when there's a casualty that's, American gets killed, then there's going to be more pressure to expand the war, not to cut it down, and that we should withdraw. But since that was published, right now, I think, Gary, if you can throw that graphic up there that we got off Fox News, it's now up somewhere around 118. So it continues to go up. And it just seems to me, Jason, that we're just rolling the dice and wondering when an American is going to be killed. You put in there, you said our troops should not be bait. I wonder if you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's sad to see that, and the map really demonstrates by bait, it really does mean isolated pockets of American interest. And if you're on the other side, if you're a bad guy, if you're a terrorist, scoring a hit on U.S. forces it's one of their number one priorities. Go back to the USS Cole in Yemen, go back to the embassies in Africa, go back to anything. Our embassy in Tehran. So always taking out a symbol of the United States prowess is a big deal for our enemies. So now we've essentially located these symbols and dispersed them in such a way that if you were Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, all you have to do is sit back and wait your time, wait for the right window, keep hitting these targets. It's harassment and interdiction, or it's the same kind of warfare that we were fighting to some degree successfully in Vietnam, but we didn't have necessarily the top level strategy. So harassing and interdicting in the rear lines is a difficult thing, and it has to be laid together with a combined arms strategy. We have not done that. So what we have are special operations forces doing little raids, little harassment, little interdiction from time to time, not able to score a big blow because that's not the resources we've deployed there. We've deployed an augment, a supplementary type of resources. Yeah. So for Kirby to sit back and think, and he's a Navy guy, I think, right? I think he's So to bypass the entire echelon of U.S. prowess in the region and leave it to handfuls of special operators, boy, you are waiting for a disaster. And that's what the Iranians are looking at. And by the way, when we talk about the fight with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, they were hitting us in Iraq while we were there. I was friends to the rat lines that would bring weapons into Iraq from Iran through foreign fighter travel from other locations. So if there was a time to go after them, the time would have been when they were killing American soldiers on an everyday basis.
Yeah.
Nobody thought that was worth it. So we really have to go back and say, well, why is it worth it now? And why are we risking our troops in this sort of bait type program? I think it's a very failed policy that we're going to see. We're going to see the downsides to that. And that's the unfortunate thing. The American people don't need to have soldiers sent back home in coffins, but that's what we're waiting for.
Yeah. Gary, throw that map back up there, if you would, please. You kind of along to your point there. You see in look in the upper left-hand corner in the Syria part there, you see there's a number of Al-Tanf garrison, Tal al-Baider, El-Shaddai, et cetera. Several of these places, those are just dots on the map. And Jason, I've been out there too. I was in a very isolated base right on the Iran-Iraq border in 2009 when I was training in an Iraqi border battalion. And I know what it's like to be isolated there. Most of my time was spent in force protection. So we were
Yes.
spending more time protecting ourselves than we were doing anything on the ground. And, it's trying to say that it's an active counter ISIS mission, that we're there to actually get rid of ISIS, is like saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to drain this swimming pool on a rainy day with an eyedropper. Yeah, every time you put that eyedropper in there, you pull some water out, but it's raining and you'll never get enough and you could never take out. That's what I think our troops are doing there. And you just touched on that, yeah, we have a lot of missions. And I bet that like 90% of every tactical mission that those guys are sent on are successful, but strategically it's meaningless. So why do we want to risk American lives for something that has no impact on our strategic outcome?
Yeah, this is hard again because I've sat in these forward locations and you recognize that, as you said, the missions can be successful. You can hit targets all day long, but the grand strategy is not tied into this, so that it's very random and it's very disconnected from any big theme. Like, what are we doing? The ambiguity of saying, well, we're countering ISIS is it's sort of disingenuous to the service member, because countering ISIS doesn't have a scope, a scale, a timeline, an endpoint, an objective, a win. And this is what we got with Iraq. That's 20 years. It's what we
That's
got with
such a great
Afghanistan.
point.
That's 20 years. So when you hand soldiers difficult missions in proximity to violence without a clear objective, that is not
That's such a great
respectful of
point.
the use of American power. And we're very good. We're going to go every day. Like, I'd raise my hand and go again if you ask me. But the problem is, you shouldn't be asking the soldier if they should go. We should be asking the American people, should we go and why? And so when you look at these isolated camps, you look at those missions that they're handed, if they're not tied to a nested national strategy that the American people understand. I'm not talking about Wall Street investors, and I'm not talking about K Street
Yeah.
lobbyists. I'm talking about the guys in Wisconsin and Ohio, farmers, people that are trying to eke out a living should know, hey, the reason we're there is X, Y, and Z, and we will know we've won when, whatever, A, B, and C. And if they
Yeah.
don't know that, then it's incumbent upon the electorate to get involved in the process
Yeah.
and hand Congress their walking papers. Hey,
Yeah.
hey, look, if you don't want to do the
Taylor,
job, get somebody else.
Yeah. And, kind of dovetailing on with that, with the consent of the governed, they also have to agree that is a viable mission, even if the government gives them one, which they haven't so far, and said this is an attainable military objective, which it's not. Then the people still have to say, yeah, I think that is worth our national treasure, the blood of our sons and daughters. Yes, it's worth that. It's not. And of course, that's one I think I'm grateful for Stand Together, because I know you guys have a much broader issue than just veterans issues. You actually care about what the people think, not the Wall Street bankers and all that kind of stuff, the moneyed people, but what the American people think. And unfortunately, they just don't have much of a voice. And that concerns me here, because it's the American people's blood and our sons and daughters who will pay for this foolishness and this lack of strategic resolve. And that really just breaks my heart.
It is heartbreaking. This is why, for individuals listening, the role that we play in this is so critical. And we've had years of lack of accountability. You can go to, again, Iraq, Afghanistan, 20 years of Singar's reports that says, hey, we're not spending money wisely. It's being pilfered. It's being embezzled. And the troops aren't getting the training. Everybody knew this for years. Our military structure lied up the chain of command, such that the American people are being told every week, every month, we're winning, and we're very close. We just need one more surge. Well, then you get to places like Benghazi, our consulate. We didn't get accountability there. Then roll the clocks forward. We don't have accountability for things like the Afghanistan disaster of that withdrawal and the Marines that were killed at that gate there. We don't get accountability when Lloyd Austin goes missing for 4 days and everyone says, that's fine. He just, was just sick and nobody knew. And so what the American people need to know is this is not a singular thing that you can attribute to one president or one set of Congress. Yeah. This is about the American people having the ability to say what they understand. If you don't understand the foreign policy, you don't need to go to school or get a PhD to do it. If it doesn't make sense to you what we're doing on the ground, then you cast that vote and say, I'm not satisfied. And don't let our politicians, congressmen, presidents get away with telling you it's all good. We've got this figured out, because I've been on the ground. Colonel, you've been on the ground. They don't have it figured out.
Man, it's when you're saying that, what you just said there, I just had to wince a little bit, because in our show just yesterday, we played a clip And Gary, I don't know if you can pull it up while we're talking here, where Austin was asked if anyone is going to be held accountable for what happened in Afghanistan. I'm sorry, in the Afghan withdrawal there. And it's such a painful thing to watch because it's exactly what you just said. And, the context being that 13 Americans were killed, that this was a complete disaster and how it was executed. I mean, I've long, and I think I said yesterday, I'm a big supporter of President Biden for his decision to get out, but just a big critic for how it was done.
Yeah.
And no one was held accountable for the disaster that was going on there. One of the congressmen asked Austin in that exchange, he said, if a Navy ship, a Navy captain runs a ship aground, what happens? And he said, he'll be removed from power. He said, has anyone been held accountable for this disaster? No. And nothing happened after that either. And
Secretary Austin, last week, General McKenzie repeated that he has many regrets about the botched, deadly, and embarrassing withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that he supports investigations into that withdrawal. A moment ago, you said you executed the president's order. You didn't tell us what you advised the president to do. But do you have regrets about the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I support the president's decision.
Do you have regrets about the withdrawal or how the withdrawal occurred from Afghanistan that cost the lives of 13 of our service members?
I don't have any regrets.
You don't have any regrets. Secretary Austin, it's very telling. Secretary Austin, has there ever been any accountability for anyone within the Department of Defense for the deadly, botched, and embarrassing withdrawal from Afghanistan? Any accountability?
Hey, listen, our troops evacuated 124,000 people off of that airfield.
Has anyone been held accountable? If a Navy captain grounded a ship, what happens immediately?
Typically, that captain is removed.
That captain is removed. Has anyone been held accountable for what happened in Afghanistan?
To my knowledge, no.
To my knowledge, no. And now then, that was in I think March 2023. And now then you have, like you just mentioned here, himself going AWOL, not telling the president of the United States, not telling his deputy. And for 48 hours, nobody even knew that we didn't have an operating Secretary of Defense. And what does the White House say? We still stand behind Secretary Austin and the great leadership he shows. Ergo, nothing's going to change.
Well, I'll give the White House credit. If the American people aren't up in arms, in other words, they're not pressing on their congressmen. Notice how when we get to these positions, we always get the congressional hearing and some whip smart congressman gets up there and asks some stinger question. And it's a little embarrassing. Everyone's like, oh, wow, Lloyd Austin said it doesn't matter. Or Hillary Clinton said, what difference does it make? And what do we get from that? What do the American people get? What does the constituent get? They get nothing. And so the Congress has a role, and they're supposed to be able to hold the executive branch accountable. And when they don't, over and over again, it's hard to blame the executive branch for skirting the edge of things or not distributing accountability down, because they've been raised in a culture by the American constituents that they can get away with whatever they want. So this is a motivation for the individuals sitting at home wondering, how does this change, or how do we get to the next level? Or what do we do about that? And that's where Stand Together thinks that the dignity of people is when they can express their voices clearly and without reservation at the ballot. Now, that means you have to have the ability to talk about these things, criticize our leaders. It's fine to support leaders, but it's also fine to criticize them and then really ask them the tough questions. If we don't do that through the election cycle, which is the only way we're connected to the U.S. foreign policy, if we don't do that, they're going to continue to do what we've seen in the last 20 and 30 years, this trend of lack of accountability. So I'm not a believer in, let's get up there and yell at them and, have zingers on Twitter or whatever. I'm interested in a couple of congressmen taking their roles seriously. I think somebody filed for or intended to file for articles of impeachment today. Okay, I'm not saying he ought to be impeached or should be, but let's at least ask the questions. Yeah. And then if America wants transparency and leadership, the way to do it is to demand it. And don't think they're going to do it on their own, because they're very happy holding a press conference, holding a hearing, walking back to their districts and running for the next election cycle. And I'm not mad at that. You can't be. We are the constituents. The founders gave us a republic, which meant that we have to, as you said, consent to be governed in the way that we intend. And if our consent doesn't put on them an emphasis like, hey, you need to get your house in order, pass a budget, audit the Defense Department, any of these natural things that we expect, then we have the right, but also the onus to hold them accountable. If we don't do that, I just want to confirm for the audience, you're going to see more shenanigans all the way down the road. Somebody should tell the truth.
Also, another piece of that, though, is that we need good people to run for office so that we have an option. Because too many times, Jason, at least from my view, it's like the people, we can go and vote. And if this guy doesn't do the right thing, we'll bring this gal over here in. But if we don't have a good gal to go to, and there's just not a good person, then we're up a creek without a paddle, so to speak. So we need more good people to run. And I advocate anyone listening here, if you're fed up with this, go run, man. Do whatever you can somewhere.
Well, I don't like to take umbrage or push back a little bit, but I have to in this council. Let's take the counsel of our history and our wise founders. They expected, the Greeks expected, the Romans expected, but our founders in particular expected that good people don't run for office that frequently. They recognize the flaws of mankind. These are positions of power. They attend it, money attends it. All these things happen to a person when they're in these positions. So we knew that, which is why we incorporated checks and balances in our legal system, our constitutional system, so that the American people had a way to just yank their chain from time to time. And we're not yanking the chain enough. I don't expect good people to run for office. I expect constituents to pull their chains more frequently, because that is the corrective. That's the measure. The vote is the measure by which we hold these men and women accountable for the actions that they signed up for. And again, I'm not mad at you if you don't want to do your job. But let's step aside and let somebody else come and do it, and we'll hold them accountable too. That's our business, and that's what the founders expected, that we would be engaged in this. Here's the tragedy, Colonel. Our American viewers don't hear about these soldiers standing in pockets of 100 and 200 in Iraq and Syria. They never hear about them. So they're clearly not that important. The only time they become part of the news, as my good friend Reed Smith points out, is when they're attacked, when there's a casualty. So it's pretty clear that the American street does not feel the investment of why they are there. The only time they consider these troops is when they're getting hit. So the point is, if we don't think through that in a way that says, well, maybe they shouldn't be there, maybe we have some different options. Are there different options? Let's challenge the question. Again, I'll go back to naval power, air power, diplomacy, statecraft. There's a ton of different ways to do this. So
and so actually, that's exactly what I wanted to get to here in the last few minutes we have. If President Biden were actually watching this show, and we really hope he is, hi if you are, and he's like, man, this Jason guy, he's got it going on. What should I do? If you had an opportunity to tell President Biden today what we should do with those troops in there, based on your piece there in the Hill, what would it be?
Well, listen, you said it earlier. Let's compliment him for the difficult decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. Let's leave aside the disaster that it became. The commitment to your forces, to your troops, is about respect. And President Biden, if you were listening, what I would say is respecting the troops understands their capacity and their capability and their limitations. And the troops on the ground are limited to what they can do. So if you really respect those troops, President, what you'll do is give the United States the ability to use the right type of military force to engage in the region with flexibility. And that means, at least for me, if you don't have a very particular objective with a soldier who's deployed with all that comes with, then let's look at other options. Other options can be naval, they can be diplomacy, they can be allies. You have a very commitment to our strategic allies. Let's get them on the hook. What else can be done? We're talking about Iraq, who just walked on our flag. Government officials walked on our flag to tell us that, hey, we don't owe you anything, and you can't just attack in here willy-nilly. So these are the same people we're funding that are also leaking funds to the people that are hitting our troops. There's a lot of questions that we can be asked.
The Iraqi government, he wasn't just some external Iranian dude. Just want to point that out.
Yes. So President Biden, respect means really using your resources the right way. It makes when you take a screwdriver to a nail, that's the wrong tool. When you take a hammer to a screw, that's the wrong tool. We're using the wrong tool.
Well said. Jason, thanks so much for coming on today and sharing some of your insights here. We're so grateful for having you on, so grateful for your service to America, both in uniform and now since it's still service to the country. We're grateful for that. Grateful for Stand Together. and we're going to be interested in watching that going on. And I hope people do take your advice to heart. Start yanking some chains, because that's what we need a lot more of. And Jason, we're going to look forward to having you back on. We want to talk some more about the Russia-Ukraine war and where that thing's going, because that hadn't gone anywhere. But thanks so much for coming on today.
Well, Colonel, I appreciate you welcoming. I'm like a cat. If you feed me, I'll be back at your doorstep anytime you ask. And God bless America. Let's keep the republic fresh and healthy, and let's respect the human dignity of everybody, including our troops on the ground.
Great word there. Thanks so much, Jason. And thanks for coming on today. We have another deep dive for you at, I believe it's 2 o'clock this afternoon. You're not going to want to miss that one. We're going to talk about how some of the politics works into support for some of our overseas operations here. It's going to be as ugly as you might think, but you're going to want to turn in, because it's good information. We stay unintimidated and uncompromised, bringing you the information you need to make sense of your world. And we will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.